Hello, and welcome to this evening's talk as part of the Association for Art History's first annual Art History Festival, a celebration of the diverse narratives that enrich our enjoyment of art, visual culture, and the world around us. My name is Dr. Susie Lishman. I'm a pathologist and a trustee of the association. I'm also a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce this event, which I'm very much looking forward to. The Association for Art History brings people together to share knowledge and inspire new ideas. It advances scholarship and professional practice through its programs and publications, and supports a broad and diverse art history community through events like this one. For those of you not familiar with the Royal College of Physicians, it's a medical charity and membership organisation representing over 40,000 doctors worldwide, with the key aim of improving patient health and reducing illness. As well as being a modern medical charity, the RCP has a 500-year history and a huge range of historic collections looked after by the archive, heritage library, and museum teams. The study of anatomy is fundamental to the understanding of the human body that both doctors and artists need. I certainly rely on the knowledge I gained from dissecting the human body every day of my working life. This evening's talk explores the story behind a fascinating painting that appears to show a simple anatomy lesson, albeit one given by one of the most eminent British anatomists and collectors. But like so many works of art, the story behind the painting is anything but simple. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Sarah Backhouse, Exhibitions Officer at the Royal College of Physicians, and invite her to tell us more about this painting in Art and Anatomy, an audience with Dr. William Hunter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lishman, for your introduction there. And hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm delighted to be here at this inaugural Art History Festival. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Gail Chapman, who will be helping me with the Q&A session at the end. And also thank you, Gail, for helping me out with the technology we have here today. Gail will be doing my slides for me. I just need to warn you, I am suffering a little bit at the moment with a bit of cold and a cough, thanks to my daughter who started school last week. So please do excuse me if I need to turn off my microphone and have a little cough at some point. Thank you very much. Gail, can we have the first slide, please? So I'm going to be talking today about what is possibly the most significant painting from our collection of portraits at the Royal College of Physicians. We have around 230 portraits in our collection. The painting is of Dr. William Hunter lecturing and was painted by Johan Zoffany around the year 1770 to 1772. Next slide, please, Gail. In the painting, Dr. William Hunter is demonstrating the muscles of the human body to students and members of the Royal Academy of Arts. This is done with the expectation that a better understanding of the anatomy of the human body would enable the artists to better paint the human form. This painting was donated to the RCP in 1825 by Mrs. Bailey, who was the wife of Hunter's nephew and heir, Dr. Matthew Bailey. Since then, the painting has been exhibited throughout the UK and abroad, first at the 1862 International Exhibition in London, and most recently in 2018 to 2019 at the Hunterian in Glasgow and the Yale Centre for British Art for the exhibition William Hunter and the Anatomy of Modern Medicine. The painting has also been extensively studied by scholars and art historians. So why have I chosen to talk about this painting? Well, personally, I find it really fascinating that despite all the extensive scholarly interest in the painting, it remains a bit of a mystery for us. There are questions about it that remain unsolved. Furthermore, once you start exploring the narratives that the painting reveals, you end up digging around in some pretty gruesome subject areas. These mysteries and hidden narratives actually tell us a great deal about gentile society in Georgian England, about how students of the arts were taught, and about how the seemingly diametrical spheres of art and medicine were actually at the time considered to be not only compatible, but essential for the accomplishment of the higher arts. Please be aware that this presentation does contain graphic images and also descriptions that you may find uncomfortable, but I will warn you before I'm about to show one. So let's have a look at the painting and its creator. This is described as a conversation piece, which Zophany did several of. It depicts an event featuring lots of people, but it's neither a formal portrait nor a history painting, more a sort of informal group portrait recording a moment in history. In the painting, William Hunter is standing on a platform in what we think is a room at the Royal Academy, lecturing in his role as the Professor of Anatomy. His right hand is resting on the back of a male model, stripped to the waist. He stands with his right arm stretched upwards, and his left arm is supported by a man standing in front of him. At the extreme right is a skeleton hanging from some sort of apparatus. On the left of the platform, on a pedestal, is a cast of a naked man with arm upraised and his back towards the viewer. On the left of the picture, sitting in chairs or standing, are Hunter's audience, a group of 25 men. The room is lit by a lamp hung from the ceiling with a circular shade to reflect light onto the stage. Can we have the next slide, please, Gail? The artist of the painting, Johan Zoffany, and his main sitter, William Hunter, were contemporaries in Georgian society. Zophany was a German painter from Frankfurt. He trained in Europe, then settled in Chiswick, London. He enjoyed royal patronage and was a familiar face in gentile society and at the court of George III and Queen Charlotte. When George III established the Royal Academy of Arts in 1768, Zophany was one of 2 artists chosen personally by the king to be founder members. William Hunter was a physician, anatomist, and man midwife, and this is the actual historical term used by the medical profession to describe an obstetrician. He was born in East Kilbride, Lanarkshire, and was the elder brother of the famous surgeon John Hunter. In 1740, William Hunter moved to London and began teaching anatomy. He became a licentiate to the Royal College of Physicians, which is why we have Zophany's painting. And in 1762, he was employed as physician extraordinary to the Queen Charlotte. He was described as the most perfect demonstrator as well as lecturer the world has ever known. And this next slide, thank you, Gail, comes with a graphic warning. Hunter's special interest was the anatomy of the human gravid uterus, in other words, the condition of the uterus in pregnancy. In 1774, he published his groundbreaking work on the dissection of a full-term human gravid uterus, which he carried out in 1751. The illustrations in his book, Anatomy of the Human Gravid Uterus, were drawn by the artist Jan van Rinsdyk, who sketched them as the dissection progressed. Next slide, please, Gail. Hunter became very wealthy and commissioned the architect James Milne to design a residence for him in Great Windmill Street in London. It had an anatomy theatre, preparation rooms, and a large museum to house his growing collection of coins, minerals, shells, insects, books, prints, and curiosities. Hunter began lecturing in this new theatre in 1767 and employed 2 assistants to help him. Next slide, please. And here is a watercolour showing a lecture at the Great Windmill Street Anatomy Theatre. In 1768, Hunter was appointed as the first professor of anatomy at the newly founded Royal Academy of Arts, where he became friends with Zophany. We don't know who commissioned Zophany's painting, but it may have been Hunter himself to mark the inauguration of his teaching. Following Hunter's death in 1783, his nephew and heir, Matthew Bailey, took over his anatomy lectures at Great Windmill Street, and after 30 years, according to Hunter's will, Bailey oversaw the transfer of Hunter's collections, anatomical preparations and library to Glasgow University, where they now form the city's Hunterian Museum, not to be confused with the Hunterian Museum in London, which houses the collection of Hunter's famous surgeon brother, John. Next slide, please. So far, so good. We have a painting showing Hunter's inaugural anatomy lectures at the Royal Academy, but there's quite a lot about this painting that isn't quite so straightforward. Firstly, we don't know where exactly this scene is set. The interior doesn't match any that we know of. When it was first established, the Royal Academy was initially housed in quite cramped quarters in Pall Mall, although in 1771 it was given temporary accommodation for its libraries and schools in Old Somerset House, which was then a royal palace. The room here does not match any known rooms in either the Pall Mall quarters or Old Somerset House. And this is strange because Zophany was actually famous for creating very accurate likenesses of people and places in his paintings. See, for example, Zophany's painting that is often paired with this Hunter painting entitled The Academicians of the Royal Academy. Next slide, please. This painting shows the founding members of the Royal Academy in the life drawing room of Old Somerset House, painted in 1772. The setting is identifiable as Old Somerset House, so we know that Zophany could accurately recreate interiors. Perhaps more interestingly, each person in this painting has been identified as a founding member of the Royal Academy. One of the members of the Academy at the time, John Sanders, even created a key to show us who was who. Next slide, please. Zophany is well known to have painted accurately from life. The English writer, historian, and politician Horace Walpole described how Zophany was able to paint a true likeness of his sitters for his Royal Academicians painting, and I quote, "This excellent picture was done by candlelight. He made no design for it, but clapped in the artists as they came to him, and yet all the attitudes are easy and natural, most of the likenesses strong." We can therefore assume that the individually identified figures in the painting represent lifelike portraits of each of the founding members of the Royal Academy. Next slide, please. In contrast, only two figures are positively identifiable in Zophany's painting of William Hunter lecturing. In this painting, we can identify William Hunter himself on stage and Sir Joshua Reynolds, who you can see here circled in red on the left. The portrait painter, Sir Joshua Reynolds, was the founding president of the Royal Academy, and he is recognised by his very distinctive attribute, which is an ear trumpet. Next slide, please. And here are some ear trumpets from our collection at the Royal College of Physicians, so you have an idea of what they look like in real life. Next slide, please. Here is Reynolds again in Zophany's painting of the Academicians, again holding his ear trumpet and standing next to Hunter. Next slide, please. So we can safely say that the figure holding the ear trumpet is indeed Royal Academy President Joshua Reynolds. And the fact that Hunter is lecturing to him makes us think that this scene does indeed show Hunter lecturing to members of the Royal Academy, probably within a Royal Academy setting. But it's interesting that no other people in this painting can be easily recognised, considering how Zophany took care in his other paintings to make sure each individual person could be identified. And I would like to say as an aside here that a lot of scholarly work has been done to try to identify all the sitters in this painting. And I would like to acknowledge the work done by Martin Possel, the Deputy Director for Collections and Publications at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, London, and a leading expert on the art of Joshua Reynolds. And also Helen McCormack, reader in art and design history in the Department of Design History and Theory at Glasgow School of Art, who has published works on William Hunter and the close relationship between art and anatomy in 18th century England. Both Martin and Helen have helped me enormously with research into this painting. Hunter himself, during one of his anatomy lectures at the Royal Academy, said, "I shall think myself much obliged to any of the members of the Academy who may be present." Now, this tells us that Royal Academy members did attend Hunter's lectures, but also that the lectures were accessible to others who were not members. Martin Possel and Helen McCormack have tentatively made some identifications of both Royal Academy members and others who were just visiting. I won't go through all of them here, but I will show you just a few. Next slide, please, Gail. Benjamin West is perhaps the figure seated 2 men to the right of Reynolds. West was a founding member of the Royal Academy and became president following Reynolds' death in 1792. Zophany himself is possibly the figure standing to the right of West, leaning forwards towards him and showing the top of his head to the viewer. The painter and enameller George Michael Moser, who was the Royal Academy's first keeper of schools, is in here somewhere, as is Richard Wilson, the librarian and keeper of texts on anatomy. Next slide, please. Hunter's lectures at the Royal Academy were designed for and addressed to the school's students. And here's a quote from one of Hunter's lectures. "I am commanded to explain the anatomy of the human body to the students of painting and sculpture. They cannot fail to make a laudable proficiency in the study if they take but half the pleasure in their part that I shall receive in mine. It happens to be an employment in what has long been my favourite study for the improvement of these arts, which have always been one of my highest pleasures." Between 1769 and 1772, 77 students were registered at the Royal Academy. In Zophany's painting, 2 young boys are present in the audience, located at the front nearest to the viewer. Perhaps these figures represent the younger Royal Academy students. As for members of the audience who were not members of the Royal Academy, this figure highlighted in the centre could be the English writer Edward Gibbon, who resembles other portraits of the writer by Zophany, and who we know attended Hunter's lectures elsewhere. Martin Postle suggests that it may not actually be possible to identify every sitter in this painting because the figures may not represent individuals, but rather a sitter type. For example, Royal Academy members, students, and society members or gentlemen of learning. These gentlemen were persons of rank who were invited to attend both presidential discourses and Hunter's lectures. The inclusion of the easily identifiable figure of Sir Joshua Reynolds was perhaps a device to ensure that the event can be firmly located within the Royal Academy, but beyond that, Zophany has left everything a bit vague. For a painter who was famous for his lifelike representations, I can't help but feel that this ambiguity was intentional. Perhaps Zophany did not want us to focus on the who in the painting, but rather the what. So let's do that. Thank you, Gail. Next slide. The Royal Academy hired the anatomist William Hunter to be their first professor of anatomy. He was the obvious choice because between 1751 and 1767, he had already been lecturing artists on anatomy at the St. Martin's Lane Academy in London. Hunter wrote that, "I am pretty much acquainted with all the best artists and live in friendship with them." The St. Martin's Lane Academy, established in 1735 by William Hogarth, was a sort of precursor to the Royal Academy, where artists and designers attended life drawing classes, as you can see in this painting also by Zophany. At this time in the mid-18th century, there were no organised official public patronage of the arts and no established body that really compared to the Académie Royale in Paris. When the Royal Academy in London was established, its official title was the Royal Academy in London for the purpose of cultivating and improving the arts of painting, sculpture, and architecture. The Royal Academy had many functions. It was a school to train young artists, as well as a guild to govern the conduct and pricing of established masters. It mounted exhibitions to display recent work to fellow artists, critics, and collectors, and it presented lectures and published catalogues to elevate public taste. And here's a painting of the antique room at the Royal Academy, also by Zophany. Next slide, please, Gail. This painting gives us a snapshot of how students of the Royal Academy learned. They are observing the human form as it was understood in antiquity and recreating works of art that were considered of the highest standard with the aim of elevating their own practice. This is the pedagogical context into which William Hunter was brought at the Royal Academy, and in many ways his lectures provided a similar experience, in other words, the opportunity to observe and recreate the human form, only this time from a position of detailed scientific accuracy. Next slide, please. Hunter was a doctor by training, not an artist, so he was very interested in teaching things like musculature, the skeletal structure, and the circulatory system. As lecture props, we can see that Hunter used a skeleton for teaching about bones, and a male model and an écorché plaster cast figure for demonstrating the muscles, which is what Hunter is doing in the painting. According to Hunter's manuscript notes of his lectures, he recognized the importance of a thorough understanding of the skeleton and the muscles, declaring that the study, and I quote, of bones and muscles will be allowed to be very essential to painters and sculptors. Every varied attitude, every action and gesture, every change of face is no other than varied muscular motion. We shall therefore consider the bones and muscles as our principal subjects. And after having explained them, we shall make some remarks upon the cellular substance and skin. William Hunter and the Royal Academy both understood that the discipline of medicine was crucial to the attainment and improvement of the higher skills of fine art. In the figure of William Hunter, an anatomist who lived in friendship with artists, the two seemingly opposed spheres of art and medicine are united. Next slide, please, Gail. But why have all these people, in the audience you can see here, come to watch Hunter teaching about the bones and muscles using a skeleton and a life model? We know why the members and students of the Royal Academy and its schools are there, because this was an obligatory part of their course. What about the other type of sitter, the society men and gentlemen of learning? Why were they here to learn about anatomy? Were they here to learn about anatomy, to learn about how art was taught, or were they there out of a general curiosity about the world and how things work? Or perhaps they were invited by Joshua Reynolds or by Hunter himself. Now, Hunter was extremely well connected and held many honours and appointments. As well as being Professor of Anatomy at the Royal Academy and Licentiate to the Royal College of Physicians, he was a Fellow of the Royal Society and the Society of Antiquities, President of the Medical Society of London, and a Foreign Associate of the Royal Medical Society of Paris and of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris. Hunter attended the famous dining club of Dr. Richard Mead. He was a royal physician and founder of the Foundling Hospital, another context in which healthcare, charitable deeds, and the art world came together. At Mead's table, Hunter mixed with the men who were leading the English Enlightenment, such as the famous poet Alexander Pope and the portrait painter Allan Ramsay. At the Royal Society, Hunter was acquainted with the American founding father, Benjamin Franklin. So Hunter knew a lot of people, and it was normal for society members to attend lectures and events outside of their own sphere of learning. There is a possibility, however, that their presence in Hunter's audience, whether by invitation or other, was motivated by something else, something perhaps a little more disturbing. Can we have the next slide, please, Gail? And this one comes with a graphic warning. We know that even though Hunter mainly used demonstration models such as the skeleton, live model, and a crochet figure in Zophany's painting, he also taught anatomy from a dissected body. And here is a caricature of the two Hunter brothers, William and John, performing a dissection. Hunter taught his first anatomy course in 1746 at his private practice at One Great Piazza, Covent Garden, where he lived with his younger brother and then assistant, the soon-to-be famous surgeon, John Hunter. The establishment of private schools of anatomy was made possible the year before, in 1745, following the separation of the surgeons from the Barber Surgeons Company, which had previously controlled public dissections. In Hunter's anatomy course, and I quote, "Gentlemen may have the opportunity of learning the art of dissecting during the whole winter season in the same manner as in Paris. In other words, they could practice on their own individual corpse." During the 18th century, young members of the British upper classes had the opportunity to broaden their education with a grand tour of continental Europe, so they would have been familiar with how anatomy was taught in Paris during the winter season. Next slide, please. From 1767, Hunter's anatomy lectures took place in his newly constructed house and school for anatomy at 16 Great Windmill Street in London, where Hunter continued to teach while also lecturing at the Royal Academy from 1768. Great Windmill Street had its own amphitheatre and dissecting rooms, as well as a museum where Hunter displayed his anatomical preparations alongside his collections. The opening of Great Windmill Street began a whole new era of anatomical study in England, and its influence was worldwide. And with Hunter's appointment as Professor of Anatomy at the Royal Academy happening at the same time, his influence in the worlds of both medicine and art became unprecedented, and he became a bit of a celebrity. Hunter's lectures at Great Windmill Street unsurprisingly attracted doctors and surgeons, as well as medical and art students. Students paid to attend the lectures, and they were always fully subscribed. We know from Hunter's lecture notes and correspondence with contemporaries that a number of well-known gentlemen also attended his lectures at Great Windmill Street. And these include the English writer Edward Gibbon, who we saw earlier, the politician and historian Horace Walpole, the author and political theorist Edmund Burke, the philosopher Adam Smith, and the poet Tobias Smollett. Hunter did, however, impose restrictions on who could attend his Great Windmill Street lectures. Unlike John Tate, who was Master of Anatomy at the Company of Surgeons, who lectured to the, and I quote, merely curious, Hunter stipulated that casual visitors could only attend at the invitation of a student, and they would be introduced at the start of the lectures. Hunter's doors were shut, and I quote, against strangers or such people as might choose to visit us from an idle or even malevolent curiosity. Now, this quote tells us that while Hunter's audiences consisted of those who were invited and had an educational or philosophical reason for being there, they also consisted of strangers who were not invited and who were there because they wanted to see a body dissected to satisfy a morbid curiosity. Now, the next slide, thank you, Gail, has a graphic warning. As mentioned, Hunter's anatomy lectures and dissections were always fully subscribed. We also know that some people attended the lectures because they enjoyed the gruesome spectacle of dissection. Hunter's lectures were in fact one of only a few places in the country where you could witness a dissection at this time. And I'd like to just quickly look at the wider context of anatomical teaching at the time, which was generally done from lectures, i.e. dissections, and illustrated books, such as this famous one by Vesalius. And Vesalius employed an artist to draw these illustrations from his own dissections. And the next slide also comes with a graphic warning. Also, sorry, I should warn you that this description is also quite graphic. The preface of William Hunter's book about the gravid uterus tells us more about how dissections happened and how they helped the teaching of anatomy. In the year 1751, the author met with the first favourable opportunity of examining the human species, what before he had been studying in brutes. A woman died suddenly when very near the end of her pregnancy. The body was procured before any insensible putrefaction had begun. The season of the year was favourable to dissection. The injection of blood vessels proved successful. A very able painter in this way was found. Every part was examined in the most public manner, and the truth well authenticated. So this is how anatomy was taught, and the teaching was recorded and communicated via the resulting textbook. Hunter considered that witnessing a dissection was how students could learn the truth. Next slide, please. Now, if you wanted to actually see a dissection, public dissections were available through societies or other learned bodies. Your main options beside Hunter's lectures at Great Windmill Street were the Barber Surgeons Company, seen here, the Company of Surgeons at Surgeons Hall, the Old Bailey, and next slide, please, and the Royal College of Physicians, which had an anatomy theatre built as part of its new premises built after the 1666 Great Fire of London. Next slide, please, Gail. Now, you might be familiar with this satirical print from William Hogarth's Modern Moral series. It shows a dissection taking place at the Royal College of Physicians. Next slide, please. Before the 16th century, dissections were generally performed in continental Europe, and the first anatomy theatres were located at universities, the most well-known ones being at Leiden and Padua. And next slide, please. The Royal College of Physicians owns 6 extremely rare anatomical tables, and here is one of them. These are the dissected nervous, venous, and arterial systems of adults and an animal, which have been extracted and preserved onto panels of wood. Now, we don't know exactly how they were made, but they are very well preserved. We believe they were used for teaching anatomy in Italy and were probably made around the year 1650 in Padua. During the summer months in Italy, dissections weren't really an option because of the heat, so tables like these would have supplemented the teaching of anatomy. Next slide, please. So let's return to William Hunter. This watercolour shows what Hunter's Anatomy Theatre at Great Windmill Street was probably like when Hunter taught there, even though it was painted after his death. It shows the theatre to be a large, stark space where Hunter conducted rational scientific inquiry rather than public spectacle, a complete contrast to Hogarth's satirical interior at the Royal College of Physicians. The big heating pipe in the centre was essential as anatomy lessons took place in the winter. Next slide, please. Now, it makes sense that medical students learn anatomy from a dissected corpse, but surely artists didn't need to see dissections. Well, apparently they did. The Royal Academy's Instrument of Foundation, approved by George III on the 10th of December 1768, stated, "There shall be a professor of anatomy who shall read annually 6 public lectures in the schools adapted to the arts and design. His salary shall be £30 a year, and he shall continue in office during the King's pleasure." At the council meeting of 17th of March 1769, which Hunter attended, it was agreed that the first 3 of his lectures should be devoted to the skeleton, and the, and I quote, "other lectures on the muscles to be at such times as a body can be procured from the sheriffs." So we know that Hunter's lectures at the Royal Academy were intended to include dissections. And we can go a step further and say that we know for sure that these dissections actually took place. We also know that, and I quote, "The President was desired to make application to the Surgeons' Company for a body to be dissected in the Royal Academy by Dr. Hunter." Royal Academy student James Ward also wrote that, "Some years ago, i.e. when Hunter taught, The study of anatomy was much talked about in the schools at the Academy, and the students attended anatomical lectures and dissecting rooms with great enthusiasm. And I wonder if the great enthusiasm that James Ward mentions was similar to the malevolent curiosity that Hunter identified in some of his audience at Great Windmill Street. I also wonder if Hunter had any control over who attended his lectures at the Royal Academy. We know that he restricted access at Great Windmill Street precisely to banish those with the idle or malevolent curiosity. So perhaps the people in his audience at the Royal Academy are here because it was the only place they could witness a dissection. This may account for why Hunter felt it necessary to gently reprimand his audience at the start of one of his lectures at the Royal Academy, and I quote, "Whatever company may happen to honour this place with their presence, it must be remembered that the lectures are calculated for the students and addressed to them only." In a letter written by Royal Academy student James Northcote, we get a distinct impression that some members of Hunter's audience certainly were there for the spectacle, and I quote, "The anatomical lectures on the dead body indeed partake a little too much of the bull beating, as then we have such a number of young surgeons and fine gentlemen with bags and swords that last time it was almost like going to see Garrick act." Now, Northcote is referring here to the English actor and playwright David Garrick, who performed with the Drury Lane Company at the Theatre Royal and became famous in the 1740s after appearing as Shakespeare's Richard III. His implication is that the audience at Hunter's dissection were behaving in the same raucous manner as if they were attending the theatre. Hunter's aversion to spectacle may be why he is not performing a dissection in Zophany's painting. Hunter wanted to present anatomy as an art for polite society, something for gentile learned people to view. He certainly disapproved of people coming to dissections out of any sense of morbid or malevolent curiosity. If Hunter commissioned this painting, it makes sense that the events depicted appear to be decorous, erudite, and sanitary, and focus on the act of teaching rather than on the gruesome teaching tools themselves. Next slide, please, Gail. But hang on a minute, what about this figure here? I'd like to just take a closer look at the Crochet plaster cast figure, because this seems to be completely at odds with the sanitary impression that Hunter was trying to create. And I'm now going to discuss crochet, which is a little bit graphic. So crochet is the French word for flayed, and a crochet figure is a plaster or bronze model made from a cast that has been taken directly from a body that has been flayed, generally a body that was already being dissected during an anatomy lesson. The skin was removed from the body to reveal the underlying musculature and bone structure. The body was then arranged in the desired pose and left to dry out overnight. The cast was then made from the body and used to create a figure from plaster or bronze, which shows the structures of the bones and muscles in very fine detail. These figures were then used by artists who wanted to understand what lies beneath our skin. Crochet figures were considered an essential piece of equipment in the anatomical education of artists and were found in art academies across Europe, and Zophany would have been familiar with them. Next slide, please. Here is a self-portrait of Zophany, which he presented to the Academy in Florence. It includes a version of the celebrated crochet figure made in Rome by the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon. Next slide, please. These sketches were made by the English portrait painter and Royal Academy member, George Romney, which clearly shows the role that crochet figures played as teaching aids for artists. Judging by the pose of the figure and the date they were drawn, these sketches are of the same crochet figure we see in Zophany's painting of Hunter lecturing. Note that the crochet figure here looks much more like a corpse than it does in Zophany's painting. Next slide, please. William Hunter himself was actually involved in the production of several crochet figures, including this one, which you can see here. It was a full-size plaster model, probably modelled from a cast made by the surgeon William Cowper, an acquaintance of Hunter's, which has the same pose. And it was made around the year 1750 as a prop for Hunter's lectures at the St. Martin's Lane Academy. In 1768, the figure was transported by cart to the Royal Academy for Hunter to use in his lectures there. And it is likely that this is the figure that appears in Zophany's painting of Hunter lecturing and of the Academicians. Next slide, please. Hunter used his crochet figure to demonstrate what is beneath the surface of the skin when no bodies were available for dissection. The original full-size plaster cast is now lost, but it was replicated in a small-scale wax version made by the Danish sculptor Michael Henry Spang, who was a student of Hunter's, which you can see here. Spang's wax figure was exhibited at the Society of Artists exhibition in 1761, and Hunter must have acquired it soon after, and it's now displayed at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. Next slide, please. Hunter is presumed to be responsible for commissioning several bronze casts made from Spang's wax figure, all measuring around 25 centimeters tall, which he gave to students as sort of portable versions of his life-size plaster figure. Now, several of these survive and are on display today, some made by the Royal Academy sculptor Edward Birch, for which he was awarded a prize from the Society of Arts in 1767. In London, this particular miniature bronze figure would have been associated with William Hunter, and it crops up everywhere in contemporary paintings. Next slide, please. In this possible self-portrait by portrait painter and Royal Academy member William Doughty. Next slide, please. In this self-portrait of Royal Academy student John Hamilton Mortimer. Next slide, please. In this painting by George Romney showing an anatomy lesson. Next slide, please. And here we have not an a crochet figure, but a skeleton drawn in the same pose, which is surely not a coincidence. Next slide, please. Now, Hunter was evidently proud to be associated with the miniature version of his figure because he posed with it in this portrait. And this portrait reveals Hunter's deep obsession with the anatomical. From his earliest days in London, anatomy was Hunter's main interest, and he wrote, "Anatomy is the only solid foundation of medicine. It is to the physician and surgeon what geometry is to the astronomer. It discovers and ascertains the truth, overturns superstition and vulgar error." And I wonder whether Hunter's art students came to share his obsession. I find this painting quite disturbing on a more basic human level. Hunter is holding the miniature figure like a memento mori as a reminder of the inevitability of our own death, and also a reminder of how small we are in the grand scheme of the universe. But Hunter was an anatomist who performed unspeakable acts upon the deceased, all legally and royally endorsed, and in the name of human advancement, of course, but nevertheless terrifying, particularly for his contemporaries. In this portrait, he holds the figure in his enclosed fist in a way that relates the almost godly control he had over the human body. Now, one question I have for you, are these crochet figures art? They were created by artists and sculptors in collaboration with anatomists, using techniques widely used in sculpting. Beyond their use as teaching devices, can these figures be appreciated in their own right? Next slide, please. To take this point further, have a look at this. This is another well-known crochet figure that William Hunter commissioned from the sculptor Agostino Carlini, which has the nickname Smugglerius. Does this figure look familiar? Next slide, please. For some reason, Hunter and Carlini chose to prepare the flayed corpse for the plaster casting by positioning it in the same pose as the famous Hellenistic sculpture, the Dying Gaul. There is no doubt that the Dying Gaul is an extraordinary work of art. So where does this leave Hunter's Smugglerius? Next slide, please. In fact, if we keep looking, we'll see that Hunter's earlier crochet figure, reproduced by Spang and Birch, echoes the poses of the figures from Vesalius's seminal anatomical work on the fabric of the human body, which every student of anatomy at the time would have been familiar with. In fact, the first anatomical drawing books for artists were based on Vesalian figures like this muscle man you can see here, so artists would have been familiar with them too. Are the illustrations in Vesalius's book works of art? If so, what about this crochet figure? Next slide, please. This line between what is a teaching aid and what is a work of art is fascinating, and today we still don't really know. Here are some visitors at the Royal College of Physicians looking at our anatomical tables, which are displayed on the walls alongside our portraits. Now, are the tables portraits? They seem to be being consumed in the same way. So what does all this mean? Are the crochet figures some kind of gruesome example of medicine mocking art, or perhaps medicine emulating art? Did Hunter perhaps feel that by making a connection between his Smugglerius and a well-known classical sculpture, his students could better understand the benefit of learning about anatomy for improving their skills? But it's all a little bit discomforting, really, isn't it? And perhaps a little unsanitary. Next slide, please. There's something else to be said about Smugglerius, which is perhaps the most important of all. In 1776, two men named Benjamin Harley and Thomas Henman were hanged at Tyburn Prison for murdering a customs house officer who had intercepted them trafficking tea on the Deptford Turnpike. William Hunter later commissioned Agostino Carlini to create a cast of the body of one of these two men, we don't know who became known as Smugglerius because of the crime of smuggling that led to his execution. So how do we feel now as viewers, knowing that this figure has been cast from an actual human being with an actual name? Next slide, please. In the 1770s, Royal Academy student James Northcote wrote the following in a letter to his brother Samuel. I suppose you have seen accounts upon the newspaper of the Jews which were hung for robbing a house and murdering a servant man in it. We had the body of one of them at the Academy for Dr. Hunter to read his lecture on, and now I begin to know something of anatomy. We had but 2 lectures on it because they might have the body fresh to cast a plaster anatomical figure from, to be placed in the Academy to be drawn from. This crochet figure shown here is believed to be the one that Hunter cast from the body of the thief that Northcote mentions, and it remains in the Royal Academy to this day. Next slide, please. So finally, returning to our painting, remember that Zophany and Hunter wanted to present anatomy as gentile and sanitary for consumption by those who genuinely needed to learn about it. Hunter certainly did teach anatomy at the Royal Academy in this way, but he also taught it using dissection. And if this painting is intended to commemorate his inauguration as Professor of Anatomy at the Royal Academy, I can't help but feel that this painting represents Hunter's ideals about how anatomy should be presented and consumed, rather than the reality of what happened in his lectures. The viewer is spared the gruesome details of anatomical teaching, and also the darker sides of the human fascination with the macabre. We know for a fact that some people attended Hunter's lectures because they relished the spectacle of dissection, which irritated the gentleman doctor. Is that what some of these people are here for in Zophany's painting? They are learned society men and enthusiastic students, but are they also human beings with a fascination with the human body and death? If we take away the dissections, which we don't see in Zophany's painting, we still only need to scratch a little beneath the polite surface of this painting to discover another gruesome element to the teaching of artists, and that is Hunter's plaster cast made from the flayed body of a previously dissected human being. This element would have been recognised by contemporary viewers, but today's viewer perhaps needs to understand the context of anatomical teaching at the time to fully understand what they are looking at. And understanding this context makes this painting very challenging for today's viewer. We know that the bodies that appeared on William Hunter's dissection table, and who were later immortalised in his crochet figures, were often unfortunate souls from marginalised communities who met a grisly ending because of their earthly crimes. And this next slide has a graphic warning. But these bodies were not, however, given with consent. In life, they had no idea that they would end up in the hands of an anatomist for the sake of enhancing the life-drawing skills of artists. What's more, bodies were often obtained from graves and workhouses, leading to a profound fear among the wider population of so-called resurrectionists. Resurrectionists were body snatchers who were commonly employed by anatomists during the 18th and 19th centuries to exhume the bodies of the recently dead. In 1752, the Murder Act was passed by Parliament, which allowed a judge to substitute the public display of executed criminals with their public dissection, with the intention of providing more bodies for the anatomists to teach from. With the increased focus on anatomical teaching in schools and hospitals in the late 18th century, there still weren't enough bodies, and corpses and their component parts became a commodity. And to make this point, in this grisly satirical print of Hunter's Anatomy School at Great Windmill Street, you can see a poster on the wall on the right-hand side reading, "Prices for Bodies." And William Hunter himself is the figure standing in the top left, surrounded by students. The practice of disinterment and dissection was hated and feared by the general public, but bodies did not actually belong to anyone legally. So the resurrectionists and anatomists were operating in a very grey, but entirely legal area. Today, we understand the importance of consent and the impropriety of voyeurism in the context of medical research and teaching. And it's difficult for us not to be repulsed by teaching methods in the past that involved dissecting an unwilling body in front of an audience that were there, at least in part, out of malevolent curiosity. And Gail, could you just go back to the previous slide, please? So Zophany's polite painting hides the gruesome reality of anatomical teaching for artists and the darker side of human nature with its compulsion to witness the macabre. but it also creates a refined facade that protects the viewer from a truth that for the general public in Georgian England was utterly horrifying, that of the real and present danger of ending up on the anatomist's table after death. Knowing what we do now about the context of this painting, how do we feel now looking at this audience, this gentlemanly doctor and this plaster cast of a flayed body, knowing that they represent on the one hand the epitome of enlightened learning and the attainment of the highest creative endeavours of mankind, but on the other hand the most extreme of human horrors, one of the greatest fears that mankind has ever had. For William Hunter and the Georgian elite, the scene of William Hunter lecturing represents erudition, the desire for learning about and understanding the world and how best to represent it in art, and the willingness to improve. Today for us, understanding what we do about the context of anatomical teaching and viewing this scene through a 21st century moral lens, we can argue that this is a painting about exploitation, social injustice, voyeurism, and power. Ultimately, Zophany's painting shines a very disturbing light on 18th century pedagogical culture and our scientific and artistic development as a nation. It shows the extreme lengths that were gone to for the advancement of culture, the arts, medicine, and human understanding. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. That's the end of my talk. I'm going to hand over to Gail now to start the Q&A session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. I'm sure everyone was very much enjoying it. I was lost there as well. We've had some great questions in the meantime. So I'll just start through those. But if anyone else has got any questions, if you want to pop them in the Q&A whilst we answer these, that would be great. We'll try to get through as many as we can, but we do need to finish at 6 o'clock because obviously there's another talk going on after this one as well. So the first question we had through was from Morag, who was a student at Glasgow University and looked at a lot of Hunter's medical materials and wanted to know, were women ever admitted to the dissections? She's imagining not, but knows that there are 2 founding women of the Royal Society shown as portraits on the wall for propriety. So a couple of thoughts there.
Oh, that's an interesting question. So without actually knowing the answer, I'm just going to hazard a guess that no, they wouldn't have been. As you've hinted, it would have just been completely unthought of. Women were not admitted to the various societies and places you had to belong to in order to see these dissections. In terms of the founding members of the Royal Academy, I'm not sure. I would still like to say no, but to be honest, I don't actually know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
Sometimes we don't. Okay, another one we had in from Sharon was wondering whether Hunter's lecture notes are in the Glasgow Museum and whether any of them have been published.
Yes, they have. And if you would like to have more information, I'd be very glad to email you biography and some information. So the Hunter's lecture notes are in the special collections at Glasgow University Library. And some of them have been published in books. And if you would like details of those, then I can certainly dig them out and get them to you somehow.
If anyone has any questions for further details, they can email our email address. I'm just going to pop it into the chat, history@rcp.ac.uk. So if you have any further questions that Sarah might be able to provide more information on, then please feel free to get in touch with us on that email. Okay, we had another question in. Oh, we're getting plenty. Right, so except from studying what was inside the human body, is there any studies on the skin of the human body? So examining the very nature of the skin, its different colors, etc.
Is that sort of generally, or is that to do with artists specifically?
That wasn't specified, so maybe if you can go with artists, whichever you feel more comfortable with.
I imagine so. I know that Hunter in one of his quotes was talking about how it's important to start off with what's inside and then work your way out. So I imagine that he would have started with the bones and then the muscles and then ended up with the skin.
Okay. And then someone's mentioned, so Sharon's mentioned that she knows John Hunter requested his body to be dissected after death. Did William do this?
Did William
dissect his brother? Yes.
Okay. So assuming that John predeceased his brother.
Do Do we know that? That might not be one.
That is actually ringing a bell. I think maybe he did, but I don't know for sure.
I'd have to check.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've had another one about women, but we've already responded to that one. So this was something I was interested in as well. You were talking about the figure and the crochet figure. There's also a skeleton in the painting. Do we know anything about the skeleton itself?
No, only that Hunter had this skeleton and he took it between his various places of teaching.
But not one, like with their crochet figures, there haven't been any details about whose remains it might be.
No.
Interesting. Okay. So more arty side question. Was Hunter inspired by Renaissance artists, Leonardo, Michelangelo, who also performed dissections?
I imagine he must have been, because he was very much involved with the art, the art scene, so he would have been aware.
But not something he specifically quotes about that you are aware of?
No, not really. I mean, so a lot of the anatomy books, for example, the Vesalius book was illustrated by, we think, a pupil of Titian from Italy. So I think sort of anatomy and Renaissance artists, as you say, were always very closely connected. So I think Hunter would have been aware of all of that.
Okay, so we mentioned, coming back to the skeletons again, there's the differentiation. Someone's asking about why we so distinctly differentiate their crochet figures from the skeletons, and is it the flesh that makes the difference, or is it perhaps because we know who they were?
Well, the crochet figure is the entire body minus the skin, and it's a cast of it. So it's not actually human remains, whereas the skeleton is, and it's only showing the bones. I think I've answered what the question has asked.
How did Hunter make enough money to set up his lecture room and large house?
Well, he was already quite wealthy because he had been teaching, and at the time he was one of the most popular doctors in London. He had royal patronage. He worked at the court closely with the king and the queen, so he would have earned a lot of money, and that's how he would have been able to afford building his house. Yeah.
Sorry, so Sharon's come back. I misunderstood her question. She wasn't asking if William had dissected his brother. It was whether William asked to have his body dissected as well, because she knew John had, but wasn't sure. Did William Hunter request his body to be dissected?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I know that in Glasgow University they have a death mask of his face, which is sort of an impression of the face in death, which is then made in plaster to kind of create a sort of a 3D portrait of the figure in death. That's all I know, I'm afraid.
And on speaking of the brothers, do we know where they themselves learned about anatomy? So which school did they attend?
So Hunter grew up in Scotland, where he learned with a surgeon in Scotland. He came to London. He originally learnt to be a priest, I think, and then changed his mind. When he moved down to London, he then learned with a surgeon called William Cowper. He was quite a well-known surgeon. I think also in Scotland he'd learnt about obstetrics from William Smellie, who was a famous obstetrician in Scotland. John Hunter, I'm afraid I don't really know so much about.
Okay. Someone's asked about whether the corpses dissected would have been both men, women, and even children. I think in your lecture you've shown both men and women with being dissected. Were children ever dissected?
So that penultimate slide you showed, Gail, which showed sort of a satirical view of Hunter's anatomy rooms at Great Windmill Street. On the wall there is the price list for bodies, and it has different prices for men, women, and infants.
Wow.
So that would imply that they are, but I don't know of any specific examples in which Hunter did that.
Okay, so we've only got a couple of minutes, so I'll just take well, hopefully this will be a short one, but we'll take a couple more. This is one about today's dissection of medical schools. I don't know if you would feel comfortable commenting on that. Is wondering if we know anything about the student cadaver ratio for dissection in medical schools nowadays.
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. A question of consent. So was any consent taken before dissection of a body?
Generally in 18th century.
I believe so. And so responding in this context, I think will be the easiest.
I mean, it's entirely possible that that might have happened, but generally it wasn't considered necessary. Bodies were generally taken from prisons, so there would be criminals who'd been hanged, or they were taken from the ground. So it's very unlikely that any consent was ever given, or that the people who needed to know would have known about it.
Okay. Right, so I'll just pop in one last question. I'm sorry we haven't got quite to everyone. I'm not sure if Art History are keeping a record of all of these, but as I mentioned, there's our email in the chat. So if you are interested in further research, please feel free to get in touch with us. So last one for you, Sarah. What is your favorite book on art and anatomy?
Oh, oh, but there are so many. I mean, obviously the Vesalius one is like the seminal work of art, and it has wonderful, wonderful illustrations, which are very, very gruesome and really kind of appeal to the imagination. So I guess it would have to be that one.
Wonderful. Okay, it's gone 6 o'clock, so I think we better finish up before Art History decide to kick us out. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, Susie, for the introduction. Yeah, unless there's anything that For Art History would like to add, thank you all so much for coming, and I guess we will see you all at another lecture sometime soon.